Greetings, chess players. My name is Chris Torres, and this is Daily Chess Musings special ongoing coverage of the 2021 FIDE World Championship Match between Magnus Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi. Game 4 of the Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi match ended in yet another draw. However, the path to the split point was anything but dull. Magnus unleashed a novel approach against a sharp Petroff variation, which produced serious imbalances. Nepomniachtchi was out of his preparation, but managed to navigate the double-edged positions with high accuracy, thus securing a hard-earned draw. Now, without further ado, let's take a look at Game 4 of the Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi match.
So we have now reached Game 4 in the 2021 FIDE World Championship Match. Currently, Magnus Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi are tied with 1.5 points apiece after 3 previous draws. Magnus has the white pieces today and starts with pawn to e4. Black plays e5, to knight f3, and knight f6. This is the Russian game, which is also known as Petroff's defense. 3 knight takes e5, and 3 d6. Because even back in the 1500s, Damiano knew that capturing 3 knight takes e4 for black leaves a lot to be desired, and Damiano even discovered this infamous trap. Queen e2, black retreats to f6 with their knight, and then kapow! Knight c6, discover check from the queen, while the knight is simultaneously threatening black's queen and the e7 square. So black is forced to exchange their queen for white's knight, one way or another. Which is partially why Nepomniachtchi played 3d6, a move that dates back to around 1824, when the Russian chess master Alexander Petroff demonstrated that black could play knight takes e4, but that it is better to preface it with 3d6. So, for his important contribution, the opening is also named after him. Almost always, white retreats their knight back to f3, as was played in this game. However, knight c4 is also an option, which Magnus used to good effect in a victory over Fabiano Caruana in 2020 during the Clutch Chess Showdown. That game continued for knight takes e4, queen e2, queen e7, knight e3, knight c6, knight d5, threatening black's queen, knight d4, threatening white's queen, knight takes e7, knight takes e2, knight back to d5, c6, bishop takes e2, cx d5. You can see the entire game by checking out my notes to this lesson on dailychessmusings.com. But right now, let's return to Game 4 from the 2021 FIDE World Championship. Magnus played 4 knight to f3. And as Alexander Petroff taught us, now black can safely play 4 knight takes e4. To which Magnus responds 5d4. By letting the black knight stay on e4 for a while, white intends to gain tempi while developing with threats against the black knight on e4. There is an important alternative to 5d4, however, and that alternative is 5 knight to c3. This move was Nimzovich's choice and is another popular option. A very nice game where 5 knight c3 was featured, and one that I have studied extensively over the years, happened in Vacancy between Anand and Kramnik in 2008. Let's take a look. So 5 knight takes c3, better than retreating back to f6 and losing tempo. But then 6 dx c3, and white's opening up lots of lines for his pieces. 6 bishop e7, black's getting ready to castle. 7 bishop f4, castle. Queen d2. Anand is preparing to castle queenside. Kramnik played knight d7, castle queenside, and then knight c5. I recommend any player considering using Petroff's defense as black to seek out my notes to this lesson where I included this game, Anand versus Kramnik 2008, in a heavily analyzed form. So go check it out at dailychessmusings.com. Back to our feature game. Jan had played 4 knight takes e4, and Magnus Carlsen plays 5d4. Black plays 5d5, which is the most logical and active continuation. Black's trying to hold on to that knight on e4 and gain a center pawn. White plays 6 bishop d3, and black plays 6 bishop d6. Now, 6 bishop e7 is another major continuation that was featured in the 1984 World Championship match between Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov. So if you're handling the white pieces against Petroff's defense, you need to be prepared for both 6 bishop d6 and 6 bishop e7. Let's take a quick look at that 1984 World Championship game. So this line was actually featured more than once during the 1984 World Chess Championship. And in this example, Anatoly Karpov was white and Garry Kasparov was black. And Kasparov chose that bishop e7 line. White castles, and then Kasparov played knight c6. He could have also castled there. White played 8 c4. And then knight b4. Karpov did not want to part with his light bishop, so he retreated it back to e2, where Kasparov played dx c4, and now Karpov played bishop takes c4, and then Kasparov castled. If you want to see this game, and it's an important game, I've included it in my notes to this lesson on dailychessmusings.com. Go check it out. But in our feature game, after Magnus Carlsen played 6 bishop d3, Nepomniachtchi plays 6 bishop d6, which is actually my preference as well. White castled on move 7, and Jan castled as well. And then Magnus played 8 c4, attempting to undermine the shaky ground that the black e4 knight is standing upon. So Jan supports his center pawn with c6. 9 rook e1, which is yet another move by white threatening black's knight on e4. Remember how I said white would be developing with threats against the e4 knight. And here black could play rook e8 to add support to the knight. However, the 2 rooks being in the open file in this situation slightly favors white. So what has become more popular is for black to support their e4 knight with bishop f5. And that is what Jan chose. And it leads to some good, complicated positions with decent chances for black. Magnus played 10 queen b3, which is an obviously very useful square for the queen to be posted at. However, there were other options, of course, and one of those is 10 queen c2 as played by Wesley So versus Rainier Vasquez in 2015. That game continued with 10 knight d7, 11 knight c3, and then knight d to f6. Wesley played 12 knight e5, to which Vasquez responded with bishop g6, knight takes g6, bishop takes h2 check, king takes h2, knight g4 check, king g1, and then fx g6. Wesley So went on to win a beautiful game in just 26 total moves. Honestly, I should feature this game on my Daily Chess Musings channel, but for right now, I've included it in my notes to this lesson on dailychessmusings.com. So back to Game 4 of the 2021 World Chess Championship match. Magnus played 10 Queen B3, and Jan plays 10 Queen D7, defending the B7 pawn. 11 Knight C3. Magnus develops by adding another threat to Black's knight on E4. So Jan plays 11 Knight takes C3. Under mounting pressure, it was time for Black's knight on E4 to leave the board. Magnus plays 12 Bishop takes F5, and then Queen takes F5, followed by 13 BX C3, which is a safer route than 13 Queen takes B7. Had Magnus played 13 Queen takes B7, play would have continued with something like Knight E4, Queen takes A8, and then Black can bring their queen back to D7, trapping White's queen in the corner. Fun stuff. So 15 CX D5, CX D5, trying to get that queen free from Black's trap. Rook takes E4, but Black wouldn't take back as that would allow White's queen to exit. So instead, Knight C6 is the move. And now White's queen is trapped and threatened by the rook on F8. So Queen takes F8, check, King takes F8. The rook has time to move away. F6, stopping White's knight from E5 or G5. Bishop D2, G5, very exciting stuff. H3, H5. Black is starting a kingside pawn storm. Bishop C3, knight to E7, A3, G4, HX G4, HX G4. Knight to H4 is best for White. G3, Bishop B4. White's bishop finds an excellent diagonal, to which Black's queen finds an excellent file, rank, and diagonal. So Knight F3 handles those threats nicely for White. Knight to F5, 27, FX G3, Queen takes G3, threatening checkmate. But 28, Bishop D6 stops that threat. And then it's best for the queen to recapture for Black. And all of that is a fun line out of my correspondence chess notes. Some very useful food for thought, and perhaps we might see a little bit of that later on in the Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi match. And speaking of which, let's get back to Game 4. Carlsen did not play Queen takes B7, but instead chose the safer BX C3. Safer, but also less forcing. Jan plays 13 B6 because with its defender now elsewhere, the pawn on B7 does best to step forward so it's protected by the A7 pawn. 14 CX D5, Carlsen trades off a doubled pawn to create an isolated pawn for Black. 14 CX D5. So both sides have a key pawn weakness for their opponents to target. Magnus should be targeting Black's isolated pawn on D5, while Jan is looking at attacking White's backward pawn on C3. 15 Queen B5. Magnus immediately targets the isolated D-pawn while also setting up a threat of playing pawn to C4 to take advantage of the fact that the D-pawn is pinned to Black's queen. 15 Queen D7. Jan moves his queen to D7, so if Magnus plays Queen takes D5 now, he will be severely punished by Bishop takes H2 check with a discovered attack on White's queen. 16 A4. So Magnus plays pawn to A4 to weaponize his isolated pawn while supporting his queen. 16 Queen takes B5. Nepo responded by exchanging queens. Alternatively, he could have played Rook to D8, as was played in the game Michael Adams versus Alexander Mirosevic in 2005. That game continued 17 G3, Bishop C7, Bishop to G5, threatening the rook, F6, deflecting the threat, Bishop to D2, Knight to C6, White plays C4, and then Black played Knight E7, rook a to c1, a6, queen takes d7, rook takes d7. Michael Adams went on to win this game on move 49. If you want to see the complete game, it is available in my notes to this lesson on dailychessmusings.com. Still another choice for black after 16a4 is 16 knight c6, as played in Shrikar Ganguly versus Roy Saptarshi in New Delhi 2006. Let's look at a few more moves from that game. 17 c4, a6 threatening the queen. Queen takes d5. Knight to b4 threatening the queen again. Queen goes to e4. Rook a to e8 threatening the queen again. Queen drops back to b1. Rook takes e1. Knight takes e1. Queen to c7 threatening h2. Bishop f4. Bishop takes f4. Queen takes b4. Bishop takes h2 check, king f1, and then bishop goes back to d6, threatening white's queen again. Black went on to win that game, and you can see how they did that by referring to my notes to this lesson on dailychessmusings.com. Back to game 4 between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. Magnus played a4, and Jan played 16, queen takes b5. 17 ax b5, of course, and 17 a5, advancing the backward pawn with the expectation that Carlsen will capture with bx a6 en passant. Remember, if you're confused about the en passant rule, that move would have looked like this on the chessboard, and it is perfectly legal and is a perfectly legal move. To learn more about en passant, please refer to my video on the subject on the Daily Chess Musings YouTube channel in the Coach Tortoise playlist. But after Jan played 17 a5, Carlsen plays 18 knight h4. Magnus embarks on a very risky strategy. The idea is for the knight to move to f5, where it threatens the bishop on d6, and then after the bishop moves, Carlsen's knight can proceed to e7, saying check, and forking the isolated pawn on d5. It's brilliant, but also risky in that he is allowing Jan to have a protected outside passed pawn on a5. 18 g6. Nepomniachtchi responds with g6 to put a stop to Magnus's menacing knight. 19 g4. Magnus Carlsen is unveiling a novel new approach in a world championship game. His idea is to move his knight to the now vacant g2 square in order to reposition the knight onto a square where it can again threaten black's isolated queen's pawn. Brilliant stuff. Jan responds by playing 19 knight to d7. Regardless of Carlsen's intentions, it obviously makes sense for Jan to develop a knight and unify his rooks. Magnus plays 20 knight g2 as expected. 20 rook f to c8, and Jan is the first to engage one of the key pawn targets. 21 bishop f4, but Carlsen develops with a threat against Jan's bishop on d6, so after 21 bishop takes f4 and 22 knight takes f4, Carlsen's knight is a threat against black's isolated queen's pawn. So both competitors have simultaneously threatened each other's weak pawn targets. 22 rook takes c3. Jan is first to capture as defending d5 with knight f6 fails miserably because of 22 knight f6. g5. Remember that g4 pawn? It moves forward to g5, kicking black's knight. And then white's knight can take on d5, where it would be threatening at least a couple of really nice forks. So rook c to b8. And now white can proceed to get their king to d3 with king f1, knight d6, king e2, knight takes b5, rook e to b1 threatening the knight, knight to d6, rook takes b6, rook takes b6, knight takes b6, rook b8. Knight goes back to d5, rook to b2, White's king makes it to d3. Rook takes f2. And then 32 rook takes a5. White's ahead in material, has 2 passed pawns, and a very actively placed king in this endgame. Suffice to say, White will win from here, which is why Jan played 22 rook takes c3. 23 knight takes d5. But with Magnus's capture, White's knight is in a perfect position to cause trouble for Jan. 23 rook d3. Jan moves his rook out of danger while placing it behind Carlsen's passed pawn. In fact, both of Jan's rooks are behind passed pawns. And that's exactly what they want to be doing. 24 rook e7. Carlsen responds by placing his rook into the 7th rank while threatening the knight on d7. These themes are familiar to anyone who has studied the famous 30 rules of chess. Jan plays 24 knight f8, and this is tactically forced. Let me show you why. Had Jan played 24 rook to d8, then Carlsen would have played rook takes d7, rook takes d7, knight f6 check, king g7, knight takes d7, rook to b3, knight takes b6, rook takes b5, knight c4, rook b4, and rook c1, where White would easily win. Furthermore, had Jan played the odd-looking 24 knight b8, I don't think Carlsen would have actually scooted his rook forward, saying check and pinning the knight to the rook, because knight takes b6 traps Black's rook on a8. So maybe the best Black can do here is rook takes d4, getting rid of one of White's dangerous pass pawns, but then knight takes a8, knight d7. White has an extra rook in this endgame and is easily winning. And of course, after knight b8, knight captures b6. Black could also try knight c6, realizing they're going to lose their rook anyways. But instead of taking the rook, Carlsen would have captured the knight on c6 with his b-pawn. Then Black could play rook d8, and White could play d5. White has an extra knight and 2 deep connected passed pawns, plus a rook in the 7th rank. So that was also definitely losing for Black. Which brings me back to the point that 24 knight f8 was actually tactically forced. 25 knight f6 check, to which king g7 is forced, and then knight e8 check, Black king back to g8, and setting up a nice little trap. 27 d5. Beautiful. Magnus is defending this d5 pawn. He's just doing it indirectly with a potential fork. Because if Black takes with their rook, the knight comes back to f6, says check to the king, and then captures the sad rook on d5. Beautiful stuff. So Jan responds to this with 27 a4, pushing his passed pawn. 28 knight f6, repositioning the knight with a check. King to g7. 29 g5, Magnus supports his knight while introducing the idea of some potential checkmating schemes into the discussion. Anytime you have a knight and a rook hanging out near your king, you have to be on guard for these beautiful checkmating patterns, many of which I've discussed in my Checking Time series of videos, located conveniently on the Daily Chess Musings YouTube channel. 29a3. Pass pawns must be pushed. 30 knight to e8 check, avoiding the pawn race. However, how would that race have played out really? Let's take a look. So had Magnus played 30 d6, Black could play knight e6, which is a very good location for this knight. It's much better on e6 than it was on f8. It's restricting White's rook's ability to move backwards while guarding the potential queening square a third time, and also opening up the possibility of king f8, as well as threatening the pawn on g5. So a lot of good stuff can be achieved immediately had Magnus Carlsen chosen to play pawn to d6. However, that's not to say that pawn d6 would have been a mistake, because it's not. White can then play d7, to which black can respond rook b8, then rook e8, which obviously is threatening to win a rook. And then white wouldn't even need to promote the pawn, because their rook could just swing back and deliver a hook mate. One of those checkmating schemes I alluded to moments ago. Again, you can learn these beautiful knight and rook checkmating patterns by watching the Checking Time series of videos on the Daily Chess Musings YouTube channel. But obviously, Jan would not have allowed white's rook to take on b8. He would have played knight d8, I'm sure. To which Carlsen could play king f1, and then black plays rook 3 takes d7. Rook takes e6 is a neat capture. And then 34 rook takes e6 is a neat way for white to capture out of order. Black plays fx e6, knight takes d7, rook takes d7, and 36 rook takes a3 would be a draw with optimum play. But that did not occur in game 4, likely because Magnus didn't like the fact after 30 d6, he's immediately helping Jan by allowing Jan to bring his knight to e6. So instead, after 29 a3, Magnus played 30 knight e8, check, king g8, and then 31 knight f6 check. So after playing several brilliant and tricky innovations, Magnus Carlsen will have to settle for a draw on his 31st birthday. Happy birthday, Magnus Carlsen. 31 king g7, knight to e8 check, king g8, and 33 knight f6 check. The draw is official here. Magnus was brilliant in game 4, but Jan Nepomniachtchi was unshakable.
I hope you enjoyed today's special presentation of round 4 from the 2021 FIDE World Championship Match between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. For more on the match, please visit the official website at FIDEWorldChampionship.com. Additionally, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my Daily Chess Musings YouTube channel. Finally, be sure to check out dailychessmusings.com to find my notes to this video, as well as thousands of other free learning resources. My name is Chris Torres, and I will see you tomorrow with a special presentation of round 5 from the Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi match.